Muhammad stands at the center of early Islamic history and remains one of the most influential individuals in the broader story of humanity. Yet describing him as a typical Arab is difficult, not because he lacked an Arabian background, but because his life moved beyond the social patterns around him. Over time, devotion and memory magnified his presence so intensely that he became both a historical figure and a symbol, grounded in events yet surrounded by layers of reverence that blur the boundary between biography and ideal. Even the idea of a typical Arab is hard to define. The peoples called Arabs were diverse from the start, and their identity shifted across regions and generations. Still, one thing is clear. The decades around Muhammad's lifetime created a powerful current that carried many Arabian contemporaries into lives far removed from their original settings. The process scattered people across vast distances, but it also produced a shared experience. In other periods of history, young men from very different backgrounds have been swept into the same imperial system and come home shaped by a common story. Something similar happened here as the peninsula's old patterns broke open and new horizons became real. Now and then, one individual's trajectory captures that wider transformation. A striking example comes from a southern Arabian leader, known in later memory by a nickname meaning the Towsled or the Unkempt. He was born in Hadramaut, at the far end of Arabia's southern world, into a ruling line that once belonged to a tribe with big ambitions. That tribe had previously attempted to unify parts of the peninsula, experimenting with leadership and alliances, and failing. After those failures, many of its people withdrew southward and settled into a landscape of deep valleys cut into harsh plateaus, places that could feel distant from the main political storms of Arabia. That distance did not last. As Muhammad's influence expanded, envoys and messengers began to reach far beyond the familiar circuits of Mecca and Medina. In the early 600s, delegations arrived from across the peninsula, responding to the rise of a new power and a new message. The Hadrami leader travelled north with one such group and encountered the political and spiritual magnetism that had begun drawing tribes into a single orbit. Like many other visitors, he returned home connected to a rapidly growing centre. Then, everything changed. Muhammad died, and the unity he had built became suddenly uncertain. Across the peninsula, alliances loosened. Many communities did not return to old pagan cults in any full sense, but they did pull back from centralized control, especially from the demands that accompanied it. Obligations that had seemed tolerable while Muhammad was alive now felt heavier. Loyalty to Medina began to look optional again. In the south, the Hadrami leader joined the wave of withdrawal. Songs and celebrations were reported in later tradition, emphasizing the sense of relief that some local groups felt at breaking away. Distance encouraged confidence. Hadramaut was far from Medina, and the old instincts of autonomy ran deep. Medina responded with speed and force. The new leadership could not allow the network of allegiances to unravel, because the entire political project depended on it. Military pressure and negotiated surrenders followed. The Hadrami leader was captured and taken north, where a second dramatic turn occurred. He was pardoned and absorbed into the ruling circle through a marriage alliance, the kind of political bond that had long functioned across Arabia. In a matter of months, a man who had broken away from Medina became tied to it more tightly than before. From that point, his life expanded outward, mirroring the wider Arab movement beyond the peninsula. He fought in major battles against Byzantium and Persia, suffered wounds, and then settled in a new garrison town in Iraq, one of several military colonies that quickly became permanent cities. From there, he joined campaigns in the frontier zones beyond the old imperial core. He entered the internal conflicts that erupted within the early community, taking sides in struggles that shaped the political future of the caliphate. In later memory, he became a controversial figure, blamed by some for decisions made in moments of chaos when compromise and survival collided. His story captures a broader reality. In 1 or 2 generations, many Arabs moved from tribal politics and local rivalries into an imperial world. Older ideals did not vanish, but new ambitions emerged. Status was no longer measured only in horses, household, and local honour. It could be measured in banners, governors' posts, and proximity to power. The change created opportunity, but also risk. The higher the seat, the more dangerous the fall. After Muhammad's death, 2 urgent questions dominated the moment. The first was leadership. A successor was chosen from his tribe among those closest to him, and that choice resembled older Arabian practices of selection and consensus. Yet the role now carried greater authority than most pre-Islamic chiefs had ever held. The decision was accepted, but not without hesitation and delay from some prominent figures. That early disagreement did not immediately shatter the community, but it planted fractures that later generations would experience as decisive. The second question was more immediate. Would the community remain intact at all? As news of Muhammad's death spread, many tribes treated earlier commitments as personal to him, rather than binding to Medina permanently. They may have continued certain outward practices, but they resisted what mattered most to the new leadership: the idea of a centralized authority with the right to demand obedience and collect dues. This conflict revealed a key tension within the early Islamic order: outward membership versus inward conviction. A person could adopt the public rituals and still resist the political obligations. The early state could accept personal belief as a private matter, but it could not accept the withholding of taxes and allegiance. The result was a series of confrontations remembered as a time of backsliding and rebellion. Some cases involved tribal leaders who insisted that they remained within the community while rejecting fiscal control. From Medina's perspective, that distinction was impossible. Prayer and payment were treated as a single package because the state couldn't survive if it allowed a model of belonging without obligation. Hard decisions followed, and harsh examples were made. Military commanders who were strategically vital were often protected from punishment, even when their methods caused outrage, because the survival of the state overrode moral clarity. At the same time, rebellion took another form: the rise of rival prophets and charismatic claimants. In a sense, this was a consequence of Muhammad's success. He had demonstrated how powerful sacred speech, leadership, and organization could be. Others tried to replicate that formula, combining old Arabian patterns of inspired proclamation with new expectations shaped by Islam's rapid growth. Some gained mass followings and created competing centers of authority. One rival was especially formidable in Eastern Arabia, building a movement that sounded familiar while challenging Medina's claim to exclusive legitimacy. Another claimant emerged in the south, tied to older styles of leadership and local power struggles. A third figure, including at least one prominent woman, appears in later tradition as part of this turbulent landscape, showing that charismatic authority was not confined to a single social type. Some of these movements collapsed quickly. Others were defeated only after heavy losses. Despite later portrayals of a total war across the entire peninsula, the outcome likely depended on a mix of decisive battles, targeted intimidation, negotiation, and the political inertia of many communities. Not every group fought to the last. Many calculated that accommodation was safer than isolation, especially once Medina proved that it could reach even distant regions. When the rebellions were contained, the leadership faced a strategic problem: how to keep newly subdued tribes united. A powerful solution presented itself beyond Arabia's borders. External campaigns could redirect energies outward and offer shared reward. In effect, conquest became both a political adhesive and an economic outlet. Soon, Arab forces moved north into Byzantine territory. The timing mattered. Byzantium and Persia had just exhausted themselves in a long struggle that left their frontier systems strained. Arab armies, smaller and more mobile, used speed and maneuver to exploit openings. Many scattered garrisons withdrew or negotiated. Local Arab-speaking communities in the region sometimes aligned with the newcomers, and the wider population watched and waited, often silent, adjusting to whichever authority proved durable. In these early decades, the boundaries between religious communities could be less rigid in practice than they would become later. In some places, Muslims and Christians shared spaces of worship for a time. Social cooperation and administrative continuity also occurred. A new ruling order still relied on local expertise, bureaucrats, and translators. Cultural contact followed political change, including the transfer of medical and scientific learning that would later flourish under Islamic rule. The result was a dramatic expansion, faster than most contemporaries could have imagined. It turned Arabia from a peripheral zone into the driving center of a new imperial system. The movement also carried older tensions with it. Rivalries within the ruling elite, competition for authority, and the challenge of governing diverse populations. What began as a unifying breakthrough in Arabia quickly became a larger, more complex struggle over power, legitimacy, and identity. In that sense, the period after Muhammad's death did not simply continue his project. It transformed it. His achievement had been an unprecedented unity of purpose at the heart of Arabia. His successors had to convert that unity into institutions, armies, and governance under conditions he did not live to manage. The empire that followed was not inevitable, but the momentum created by the early community made it possible. And once it began, it reshaped the region and then the world. In the regions taken from Byzantium, many inhabitants adjusted quickly to the arrival of the new rulers. In parts of Syria and Palestine, large communities of Christians who followed theological traditions rejected by Constantinople had long lived under suspicion and pressure. For some of these groups, the new authorities from Arabia appeared less intrusive than the imperial administration they replaced. Jewish communities in several cities also seem to have accepted the new situation with little resistance. Stability mattered more than ideology, and everyday life continued under different masters. Most people were not soldiers. Armies fought and cities sometimes resisted, but the majority of the population remained in their villages and towns. They paid the new taxes, complained about them, then adapted. Over time, many realized that the burden was manageable and that local routines could continue. The transition from Byzantine or Persian rule to the authority of Medina often involved less disruption than might be expected from later descriptions of dramatic conquest. The advance was not effortless. Some strongholds resisted stubbornly. One coastal city in Palestine held out through a prolonged siege before finally surrendering. Fighting could be intense and personal. Stories circulated of individuals driven by grief or fury into desperate acts of violence, illustrating the emotional intensity of the conflicts. Warfare remained brutal, even when victories came quickly. The decisive turning point in the struggle against Byzantium came in the summer of 636 at the river Yarmouk. The Arab army gathered in full strength, facing an imperial force of similar size. For weeks, clashes broke out across the rugged landscape before a final confrontation determined the outcome. The Byzantine formations eventually collapsed, and many soldiers were trapped in the ravines along the river. The defeat permanently weakened imperial control over Syria. Despite later portrayals of a simple religious conflict, the battle lines were not clearly divided along ethnic or confessional boundaries. Arab tribes fought on both sides. Some groups had long served the empire as allies and continued to do so. Others shifted their allegiance as circumstances changed. Loyalties could follow kinship ties or personal honor rather than political ideology. While Byzantine authority declined in the west, the confrontation with Persia unfolded in the east. Here, the Arab armies encountered a civilization that had defined their world for centuries. Persian court culture appeared distant and elaborate compared with the simpler traditions of Arabia, and the contrast became a theme in later accounts. Yet these encounters also revealed a meeting between two different political traditions, rather than a simple clash between civilization and barbarism. Negotiations sometimes broke down in dramatic fashion, and war followed. The decisive struggle occurred near the edge of the fertile lands of Iraq, where irrigated fields gave way to open steppe. Arab forces advanced from the desert toward the rich agricultural regions that had long attracted raiders. Facing them stood a larger imperial army determined to defend the heart of the Persian realm. Numbers reported in later sources vary widely, but the outcome is clear. Mobility and discipline helped the Arab forces withstand repeated attacks. Archery played a crucial role, with volleys of arrows cutting through heavy armor. After prolonged fighting, the Persian army collapsed. The victory opened the way to the great cities of Mesopotamia and beyond. For many of the warriors involved, the scale of what lay ahead was difficult to grasp. They had set out to raid neighbouring lands and found themselves standing at the threshold of an empire. The fertile countryside of Iraq, with its canals and palm groves, represented wealth beyond anything familiar in Arabia. Yet the conquest of the entire Persian plateau and the distant regions beyond remained almost unimaginable. The collapse of Persian power transformed the political landscape. Ancient dynasties disappeared, and once famous cities declined. Old centres of culture lost their importance as new towns rose nearby. Monuments from earlier ages fell into ruin, and traditions that had defined earlier generations faded from memory. The first generation of conquerors often showed little attachment to the pre-Islamic past. Earlier traditions were increasingly described as an age of ignorance, something to be left behind. The momentum of expansion pushed attention forward rather than backward. Success seemed to confirm the belief that a new era had begun. Rapid expansion owed much to favourable conditions. Neighbouring empires had been weakened by years of war, while the Arab armies were hardened by recent campaigns within Arabia. Leadership combined negotiation with force, and opportunities were exploited quickly. Luck and timing played their part as well, contributing to victories that might otherwise have been impossible. Once internal rebellions were suppressed, expansion beyond Arabia became a practical necessity. Unified tribes that had previously fought one another now needed new outlets for their energy. External campaigns provided both purpose and reward. Conquest bound the community together as effectively as belief. The new empire grew with extraordinary speed. Within a single generation, Arab armies moved across thousands of kilometers. Small groups of migrants settled in distant lands, establishing new communities that maintained connections with their origins. Families became scattered from North Africa to Central Asia, creating networks that stretched across the known world. These movements were carried out mostly overland. Leaders often preferred routes accessible by camel, which provided mobility and supply without dependence on ships. Occasionally, expeditions crossed the sea, but these ventures were exceptions rather than the rule. Despite remarkable successes, the conquerors remained few in number. Garrisons were established in key locations, but vast regions contained only scattered Arab settlers. Expansion often outpaced consolidation. Some campaigns produced only temporary control, and later, generations would struggle to maintain what had been won so quickly. The new empire depended on a combination of military strength and economic organization. After a city was taken, one of the first steps was often the establishment of a market. Trade expanded alongside administration, transforming former raiders into merchants and tax collectors. Markets and places of worship appeared side by side, reflecting the dual nature of the new order. Taxation became the foundation of imperial stability. Non-Muslim communities paid levies in exchange for security and autonomy. Agricultural regions were especially valuable, and revenues from irrigated lands provided steady income. Leaders understood that prosperity depended on preserving productive systems, rather than destroying them. Violence against civilian populations was usually limited, though exceptions occurred when resistance persisted. More often, the conquerors preferred stable taxation to devastation. Economic benefit proved more reliable than destruction. The expansion also reshaped Arab society itself. Soldiers settled in new towns that served both as military bases and commercial centers. These settlements became places where nomadic traditions gradually gave way to urban life. Migration away from Arabia loosened older ties and created new identities. Intermarriage played a major role in this transformation. Men from Arabia married women from the conquered regions, and their descendants inherited mixed backgrounds. Over time, the distinction between Arab and non-Arab became less clear. Language and culture provided unity even as ancestry diversified. Newcomers often joined Arab tribes through formal affiliation, becoming part of the social structure while retaining memories of different origins. These relationships expanded the community far beyond its original size. Within a few generations, people of varied backgrounds identified with the same traditions and institutions. Cultural exchange followed political expansion. New influences entered the cities of Arabia itself, bringing different customs and styles of life. Some leaders tried to preserve older ways, urging simplicity and discipline, but change proved unstoppable. The society that had begun in the deserts of Arabia became increasingly cosmopolitan. Migration was not random. Authorities directed settlement to maintain control and ensure military readiness. New towns served as centers from which further campaigns could be launched. They also acted as places where former nomads could adapt to a more organized and stable way of life. Life in these settlements combined opportunity with obligation. Wealth flowed in from conquered territories, but military service remained essential. Families often stayed behind while men traveled on campaign, returning with goods and stories from distant lands. The transformation of Arabia's people was as significant as the expansion of their territory. What began as a regional movement developed into a vast political and cultural system. Within a few decades, communities that had once lived by tribal rhythms found themselves participating in an empire that stretched across continents. The deliberate movement of tribes into new settlements and the organization of large groups of fighters into structured communities might remind modern observers of later centralized systems of mass control. Yet the atmosphere in the early Islamic frontier cities was very different. These settlements combined strict military discipline with open commercial life, and they served a rapidly expanding state that was still defining its character. The great garrison towns of the early conquests, places such as Kufa and Basra in Iraq, Fustat in Egypt, and Kairawan in North Africa, stood at the edges of the known world like forward operating bases of a new civilization. Their strength came not from fleets and harbours, but from control of the deserts and caravan routes. The new Arab power rested on mobility across land, just as later, maritime empires would rely on oceans. These towns functioned both as fortresses and as centres of exchange, combining soldiers and merchants in a single system. In this sense, they resembled later trading outposts where commerce and conquest advanced together, though here the process unfolded across dry lands rather than sea lanes. Long before the conquest began, merchants from Western Arabia had developed partnership arrangements that allowed investors to share both risk and profit in trading ventures. These financial methods later became familiar across many parts of the world. When military expansion added new territories to this commercial foundation, the scale of activity increased dramatically. Frontier towns became staging grounds for campaigns while also acting as marketplaces linking distant regions. The leadership that directed these changes understood that constant raiding could bring quick wealth, but could not sustain a long-lasting state. Permanent prosperity required stable markets and functioning cities. The commercial background of the ruling elite helped shape this approach. They transformed the raw energy unleashed by religious and political unity into a more organized system that resembled the large empires that had dominated the region before them. With Persia collapsing and Byzantine power retreating, the opportunity existed to build a new imperial order in their place. For a time, the system functioned effectively. The new settlements were placed with strategic care. Basra stood near the head of the Gulf, where river and sea routes met. Kufa rose in the borderlands between cultivated fields and open steppe, close to the ruins of older civilizations. In Syria, long-established cities continued to serve as administrative centers, while the countryside was divided into military zones. In Egypt, a new settlement was founded near the Nile at the point where Upper and Lower Egypt joined, creating a base from which expeditions could move westward. Eventually, another major frontier city appeared in North Africa, linking inland routes with the caravan networks of the western deserts. Each of these settlements developed in its own way, but certain features appeared everywhere. Many began as enormous encampments that could be dismantled and moved if necessary. Early buildings were sometimes constructed from materials that could easily be taken apart when armies marched away. Over time, the temporary camps became permanent cities. Their populations grew quickly and included people from many regions. Some newcomers joined Arab tribes as allies and fought alongside them in early campaigns. In the beginning, they often received equal pay and status. But as Arab numbers increased and government resources tightened, these arrangements sometimes ended and foreign fighters were pushed aside. Despite these tensions, the frontier cities became culturally diverse places. Captives and immigrants brought architectural styles and building techniques from distant lands. Trade routes connected these settlements with regions as far away as India, Africa, and Central Asia. Goods from many parts of the known world passed through their markets. River routes and caravan roads carried timber, ivory, textiles, and agricultural products toward the new centers of power. Geography favored some cities more than others, but everywhere growth was rapid and dramatic. Yet the same system that created strength also contained weaknesses. Many settlers retained the habits of nomadic life and could disperse quickly when hardship struck. More dangerous still, the population never fully merged into a unified community. Tribal identity remained strong. Military units marched under tribal banners, and the divisions of the battlefield were reproduced inside the cities themselves. Entire quarters were assigned to different tribal groups, each with its own gathering places and places of worship. Even collective religious life did not erase these separations. The ideal of a single united community remained powerful in theory, but older loyalties persisted in practice. Rivalries multiplied as time passed. Northern and southern tribal groups competed with one another. Large tribal confederations broke into smaller factions, and these smaller groups developed their own internal loyalties. Old patterns of competition returned once the momentum of conquest slowed. Expansion had held the system together, much as constant motion keeps mixed liquids from separating. When that motion slowed, divisions became visible again. Another difficulty lay in the moral framework of the early empire. The religious teachings that had inspired unity had not yet produced a fully developed social order. Military campaigns and territorial administration demanded constant attention, leaving little time to build stable institutions. Equality in principle did not always translate into equality in practice, especially between Arab conquerors and newly incorporated peoples. The early empire remained a society in transition, balancing inherited traditions with emerging ideals. Despite these tensions, the new settlements became centers from which Arabic language and culture spread across vast regions. Other conquerors in history often adopted the cultures of the lands they ruled. In this case, the opposite occurred. The original conquerors gradually blended into the populations they governed, but their language endured and became the medium of administration, trade, and learning. Over generations, the original tribal identities faded while a broader cultural identity took shape. The departure of so many ambitious people transformed Arabia itself. Migration drained the peninsula of talent and energy. The old homeland became a sacred center visited for religious reasons, but no longer the main stage of political or intellectual life. Leadership and scholarship shifted to the new cities. Within a few generations, the great cultural centers lay far from the original homeland. Economic changes reinforced this transformation. Regular payments were introduced for those who had participated in the early struggles of the community. These stipends provided a secure livelihood and passed from one generation to the next. The intention was to distribute wealth fairly and support the growing society, but dependence on state payments became inevitable. At the same time, enormous quantities of treasure flowed into the new capitals from conquered lands. Wealth accumulated in private hands on a scale unknown in earlier times. Some early leaders maintained simple habits, but others became extremely rich. The contrast between early ideals and later realities became increasingly obvious. The concentration of wealth encouraged competition for influence. Political authority now controlled access to vast resources, and struggles for leadership intensified. At the same time, the written text of the sacred scripture was standardized and distributed across the empire. This effort helped preserve a common language and a shared religious reference point, even as political unity weakened. The written text became a central element in maintaining cultural cohesion across widely scattered regions. Yet, political unity proved harder to maintain. Disputes over authority emerged soon after the first generation of leaders passed away. At first, these disagreements were less about religious doctrine than about who should exercise power. Rival clans within the ruling tribe competed for leadership. Accusations of favoritism and corruption increased tensions. Governors drawn from powerful families controlled important provinces, and many observers saw this as a return to older patterns of privilege. Event marked a turning point. From that event marked a turning point. From that moment onward, political conflicts increasingly took on a religious dimension. Each side claimed to represent the true path, and compromise became more difficult. The next leader attempted to restore fairness and reduce inequality, but opposition quickly formed. Former allies turned into enemies, and armed conflict followed. One major battle pitted leading figures of the community against one another, and resulted in heavy casualties. The struggle demonstrated that unity had broken down beyond repair. Another powerful rival soon emerged from a distant province and demanded justice for the earlier killing. The confrontation between the two sides grew into a long and destructive war. Fighting continued for months along the banks of a great river. The scale of violence surpassed earlier internal conflicts. Exhaustion finally brought the fighting to a halt, but no decisive settlement followed. Arbitration failed to resolve the dispute, and rival claims to leadership persisted. The outcome marked the end of the first period of unity. Political divisions hardened into lasting factions. Conflicts that began as struggles for authority evolved into deeper divisions that would shape later history. These divisions remained visible long after the original participants had disappeared. Near the end of the year 691, the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik left Damascus and travelled east to the Iraqi city of Kufa. A decisive victory had just been won nearby. Musab ibn al-Zubayr, the brother of Abd Allah ibn al-Zubayr and the main commander of the anti-Umayyad forces in Iraq, had fallen in battle. The rebellion that had divided the empire for years was collapsing. In the governor's palace at Kufa, Abd al-Malik stood before the severed head of his defeated enemy, a grim sign that the struggle for power was nearing its end. Stood in this same hall before, and had stood in this same hall before, and had seen other heads displayed in the same place. First, he had seen the head of Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, placed there by the governor Ibn Ziyad. Later, he had returned and seen the head of Ibn Ziyad himself displayed after his death. Still later, he had seen the head of Mukhtar, who had led a revolt in Hussein's name. Now, Musab's head rested before the caliph. Hearing this, Abd al-Malik reportedly ordered that part of the hall be demolished, as if to break the chain of violent memories that hung over the place. The sequence of deaths reflected the troubled decades that followed the rise of the Umayyad dynasty. Hussein, the son of Ali, had attempted to challenge Umayyad authority in 680 but was killed with his followers. His death became the defining tragedy for those who supported the family of Ali and would later be known as the Shia. Years afterward, Ibn Ziyad, the governor responsible for suppressing Hussein's revolt, was killed during an uprising led by Mukhtar, a radical supporter of the same cause. Mukhtar himself died not long afterward when forces loyal to Abd Allah ibn al-Zubayr defeated him and took control of Iraq. Now, Musab, who governed Iraq for his brother Abd Allah, had also fallen in battle. Abd Allah ibn al-Zubayr continued to resist in Mecca, but his defeat was approaching. These events stood in sharp contrast to the situation 3 decades earlier, when Muawiyah, founder of the Umayyad dynasty, had finally secured widespread recognition as caliph. The year of his victory had been celebrated as a time of unity. Looking back from the turmoil of Abd al-Malik's reign, that earlier optimism seemed misplaced. The empire had never truly become united. Muawiyah's rise marked the return of the old Meccan elite to power, though now ruling from Damascus instead of Mecca. Before the rise of Islam, the leading families of Mecca had dominated trade and politics in Western Arabia. Muhammad's message had overturned that order. After decades of struggle, Muawiyah restored his family's position in a new form. Many people accepted the change because it offered stability after years of conflict. The restoration of hereditary rule became clear when Muawiyah appointed his son Yazid as successor. This decision was controversial. Earlier, caliphs had been chosen through consultation or agreement, but never through direct inheritance. Opposition came less from religious argument than from traditional ideas of noble descent. Critics claimed that more distinguished families deserved leadership. The disputes reflected old rivalries within the tribe of Quraysh. rivalries that had existed long before Islam. Islam had taught that true honor came from faith rather than ancestry. It had emphasized a community united by belief rather than tribe. Yet political reality often returned to older patterns. Leaders still measured prestige through lineage and family reputation. Arguments about noble descent continued to influence politics, even as religious ideals proclaimed equality. Later generations described the early Islamic movement as a transformation from tribal society to a religious state. Loyalty was now directed toward the worship of one god, rather than toward ancestral traditions. The new faith had brought victories, migrations, and expansion across vast territories. Peoples from different regions had become part of a single religious community. Yet beneath this new unity, older forms of competition survived. Some later traditions claimed that Muhammad himself predicted the change. According to these accounts, he said that the caliphate would last 30 years and would then be replaced by kingship. Whether authentic or not, such sayings reflected later dissatisfaction with Umayyad rule. Muawiyah had transformed the solidarity created by Islam into a system centered on his own family. Instead of a community guided primarily by religious ideals, power resembled that of earlier Arab monarchies. The Umayyads could be seen both as the first Islamic dynasty and as the last continuation of older Arab kingship. Stories circulated that illustrated this mixture of old and new. One tale described Muawiyah's mother Hind being told by a seer that she would bear a king. The prophecy proved accurate, though it ignored the religious revolution that made such kingship possible. Muawiyah's rule also continued earlier political traditions in Syria. Before the Muslim conquests, Arab client kings, known as the Ghassanids, had ruled the region on behalf of Byzantium. Their former subjects remained largely Christian and spoke Aramaic. Similar conditions existed farther east, where populations were neither Arab nor Muslim. The Umayyads governed these lands while maintaining outward loyalty to Islamic ideals, which provided legitimacy for their authority. At the same time, many Umayyad rulers enjoyed pleasures that religious critics later condemned. Wine drinking and court entertainment were common. Some caliphs developed reputations for extravagance. One ruler was said to have shown open disrespect toward the sacred text, earning a reputation as the disgrace of his family. Such stories were often repeated by later writers who opposed the Umayyads, yet they reflected genuine tensions between political power and religious expectation. For the caliphs, religious duties could be burdensome obligations rather than personal devotion. Delivering the weekly sermon at Friday prayer was part of the ruler's role. Abd al-Malik once complained that this responsibility had aged him prematurely. Religion served the state, but the state did not always reflect religious ideals. Muawiyah himself was widely respected as a capable ruler. He listened to complaints, studied history, and governed with patience. Contemporary observers praised the peace and stability of his reign. For many people, his rule seemed to restore order after years of chaos. Critics later accused the Umayyads of departing from Islamic tradition. Yet that tradition was still developing during their time. The older traditions of Arab kingship stretched back centuries. Muawiyah stood within that longer historical continuity. He was remembered as a leading figure among the Arabs, and under his leadership, Arab history followed its own established path. The Umayyad rulers combined elements of desert and city life. Like earlier Arab dynasties, they maintained ties with the nomadic tribes of the Syrian desert. These tribes provided military support and formed the backbone of Umayyad armies. Hunting and horse racing remained popular aristocratic pursuits. Desert residences were built where rulers could enjoy leisure and display their wealth. Some of these desert palaces were richly decorated. One of the most famous included paintings labelled in both Arabic and Greek. Scenes depicted rulers from distant lands as well as symbolic figures representing knowledge and victory. The decoration reflected a world in which Arab rulers now stood alongside the great powers of earlier history. Even the dome of the bathhouse displayed the stars of the sky, suggesting a universal perspective that extended far beyond Arabia. Despite these desert retreats, Damascus remained the center of power. The city stood within a fertile oasis and possessed a long history as a major urban center. Compared with the modest environment of Medina, Damascus represented wealth and luxury. Some observers saw it as dangerously worldly, a place where rulers risked forgetting spiritual values. Many leaders sought worldly reward alongside religious legitimacy. Governors negotiated their loyalty in exchange for wealth and authority. Control of provinces meant access to taxes and resources. The caliphal court depended on steady revenues to maintain its splendor. Visitors described palaces paved with marble and decorated with gold. Perfumes filled the halls and richly dressed attendants surrounded the ruler. Poets and scholars gathered at court, preserving the traditions of Arabic literature while adapting to new conditions. Some poets celebrated tribal values, while others reflected the emotional and refined tastes of urban society. Arabic culture itself was changing. Traditional poetry remained important, yet themes and styles evolved. Life in cities softened the harsh simplicity of desert existence. The transition from nomadic life to urban civilization reshaped Arab identity. The Umayyads also inherited artistic traditions from conquered lands. Architectural styles from Byzantine and Persian regions influenced their buildings. This blending reached its highest expression in religious architecture. The Great Mosque of Damascus stood on a site that had long been sacred. Before the Muslim conquest, it had served as the city's main church. For many years, Christians and Muslims shared the same complex. Eventually, the Christians moved to another location, and construction began on a grand new mosque. Thousands of craftsmen worked on the project, producing vast mosaics of trees, buildings, and flowing water. The images suggested a vision of paradise without depicting living creatures. Foreign visitors who saw the mosque recognized the strength of Umayyad rule. Some believed the Arabs would not endure as a lasting power, but the scale and beauty of the buildings suggested otherwise. One caliph considered removing the gold decoration and distributing the wealth to the poor. After visiting envoys expressed their admiration, he abandoned the plan. The splendor of the mosque demonstrated the permanence of the new order. The Umayyad state combined religious symbolism with older political traditions. Public devotion supported legitimacy, yet worldly power remained dominant. One observer later described the system as Islamic in appearance, but rooted in earlier customs and influenced by Byzantine imperial models. Only one ruler stood out for unusual piety. He lived simply and avoided luxury. His short reign left little lasting change, and the more worldly style of government soon returned. During the Umayyad period, religious scholarship was still developing. The sacred text existed, but the legal and theological systems that later defined Islam had not yet taken shape. Scholars who would later establish Islamic law were only beginning their work. At the same time, Arabs ruled a vast territory, stretching across continents. To secure their position among older civilizations, they developed stories about their distant past. Oral historians recounted ancient migrations and legendary kingdoms. These traditions linked the Arabs to earlier empires and gave historical depth to their new power. Genealogies connected Arab tribes to biblical figures. The ancestor, Ismail, became a unifying figure linking Arabs to the wider tradition of monotheism. stories described his settlement in Mecca and his descendants, spreading across Arabia. These narratives gave Arabs a shared origin that strengthened their collective identity. Other traditions provided southern Arabs with their own ancestral figures. Over time, genealogies connected northern and southern groups within a single lineage. These constructions were less historical record than expressions of collective identity. Through such traditions, diverse peoples were incorporated into a single Arab community. Language and culture unified groups that had once been separate. Entire populations adopted Arabic identity through this process. Political unity required large numbers of Arab settlers across the empire. Southern Arabs provided essential reinforcements. Without them, the expanding empire might not have been sustainable. Administrative reforms strengthened this cultural unity. Abd al-Malik introduced new coinage, bearing Arabic inscriptions, and replaced Greek and Persian with Arabic as the language of government. This decision transformed Arabic into a language of administration and scholarship. Officials across the empire had to learn Arabic in order to advance. Writing expanded rapidly, and new script styles developed to meet administrative needs. Diacritical marks became more common, making reading easier. These reforms made Arabic both a sacred language and a practical one. The sacred text had preserved the language, but government administration spread it widely. Without this change, Arabic might have remained limited to religious use. The Arabic language became the bond connecting distant regions. Other languages gradually declined as Arabic expanded. The cultural influence of the Arabs outlasted their political dominance. Non-Arabs played an important role in preserving and developing Arabic culture. Scholars and poets from diverse backgrounds mastered the language and contributed to its literature. Some rose from humble origins through their skill with words. At the same time, Arab society faced internal divisions. Tribal rivalries persisted, especially between groups identified as Northern and Southern Arabs. These divisions reflected social differences between nomadic tribes and settled communities more than actual ancestry. Political struggles deepened these rivalries. Supporters of different leaders aligned along tribal lines. Conflicts in distant provinces often reflected these underlying divisions. The greatest division emerged between supporters of Ali and supporters of the Umayyads. The assassination of Ali and the death of his son Hussein created lasting bitterness. Hussein's defeat became a central event in the memory of his followers. Another major challenge came from Abd Allah ibn al-Zubayr, who established a rival caliphate in Mecca. His forces controlled large parts of the empire for many years. Eventually, Abd al-Malik defeated him after a long siege. Even after victory, unity remained fragile. Rebellions continued in Iraq, forcing the caliph to rely on harsh governors. One of these officials ruled with extreme severity, crushing opposition and executing thousands. His speeches threatened violence and promised punishment, and his reputation for cruelty became legendary. Despite such efforts, Arab society continued to change. The Arabic language spread, but spoken forms evolved as Arabs mixed with other peoples. Everyday speech became increasingly diverse. Foreign influences shaped the language through households, markets, and cities. The formal language of literature remained stable, while spoken dialects developed new forms. In time, Arabic became one of the great languages of civilization. It spread across vast regions and connected diverse peoples. Yet, the expansion of the language also transformed Arab identity itself. The spread of Arabic language and culture did not automatically mean the spread of Islam. Many people learned to speak Arabic while keeping their older beliefs, and even in later centuries, large communities of Arabic speakers remained outside the Islamic faith. Yet in the early period, conversion to Islam often required a person to attach himself to an Arab tribe as a client. These new members were known as maulas. Becoming a maula created a formal bond with Arab society, but it did not erase earlier traditions or identities. Most converts continued to preserve their own customs and ways of thinking, even while adopting the language and religion of their new rulers. Over time, Arabic and Islam began to create a wider cultural unity that included many different peoples. This unity did not erase diversity, but brought it together into a shared framework. Earlier, Arabs had defined themselves mainly in contrast to outsiders, especially through language. The distinction between Arabic speakers and non-Arabic speakers had once been clear. As more people adopted Arabic speech and culture, that distinction became blurred. The newcomers were no longer simply outsiders. They became part of the definition of what it meant to belong to the Arabic world. The career of the governor Ziyad shows how uncertain identity could become in this changing society. His origins were unclear, and even his parentage was disputed. Some believed he was the son of a Persian slave, while others claimed he was the illegitimate son of a powerful Meccan leader from the pre-Islamic period. Later, the ruling caliph publicly recognized him as a relative. Whatever his ancestry may have been, Ziyad rose to prominence through his intelligence and especially through his mastery of eloquent Arabic speech. Those who heard him speak as a young man believed that if he had been born into one of the great Arab families, he might have dominated the entire Arab world. Eventually, he secured a place within the leading tribe and became one of the most powerful officials in the empire. His rise showed that language and ability could sometimes matter more than birth. Long before the rise of Islam, the Arabic language had given its speakers a sense of common identity. After the emergence of the new religion, Arabic helped unify the expanding community even further. Yet this same process also weakened older tribal boundaries. As Arabic spread, it empowered people who had once stood outside the tribal system. The traditional solution had been to incorporate outsiders into tribes as clients or allies. This approach had worked while Arabs remained a minority, ruling a limited territory. It became far less effective when the empire expanded and non-Arabs came to outnumber the original conquerors. The ruling elite struggled to adapt to this new reality. Divisions appeared within Arab society itself, and leaders attempted to preserve older ideas of Arab privilege, even as the empire became increasingly diverse. Some reacted by emphasizing the superiority of Arabs and treating other peoples with contempt. Despite earlier religious teachings that stressed equality, many non-Arab groups were spoken of with hostility. Harsh language directed against Berbers, Slavs, Copts, Nabateans, and other communities reflected both arrogance and anxiety. Beneath the pride lay a fear that Arabs might lose control of the vast territories they had conquered. That fear was not unfounded. The empire continued to expand, and the armies that carried out new campaigns increasingly included large numbers of non-Arabs. One of the most striking examples of this development can be seen in the conquest of Spain. The commander who led the invasion across the strait into Iberia was Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber officer who was himself the client of another client family. His background illustrated how far the empire had moved from its original foundations. The story of Tariq's career began decades earlier, during the first conquests in Iraq, when Arab forces captured a group of prisoners that included scholars and soldiers from many backgrounds. Among them was a Christian Arab named Nusayr, who became a slave and later a freed client of the ruling family. His son, Musa ibn Nusayr, rose through the ranks and eventually commanded armies across North Africa. By the time his forces reached the Atlantic coast, they had absorbed so many Berber recruits that they could hardly be described as purely Arab armies. The problem then arose of how to reward the growing number of soldiers. Expansion had to continue if the armies were to be satisfied with land and wealth. Musa therefore turned his attention northward toward the Iberian Peninsula. In the year 711, he sent Tariq across the narrow sea to attack the Visigothic kingdom. The mountain where Tariq landed later took his name and became known as Gibraltar. The long history of Muslim Spain began with this expedition led by a Berber officer who descended from a line of former slaves. Although later historians describe the conquest in strongly Arab terms, the reality was more complex. Stories were told in which Tariq delivered stirring speeches in elegant Arabic before battle, encouraging his soldiers to stand firm and promising them victory and reward. These accounts reflected the desire of later writers to present the conquest as an Arab achievement. In truth, many of the soldiers would not have understood such speeches, and the army itself was largely Berber in composition. The image of Arab knights conquering Spain belonged more to memory and imagination than to historical reality. The reliance on non-Arab soldiers showed that the original Arab population was too small to maintain expansion on its own. Arabs increasingly delegated the work of conquest to others. While this allowed the empire to continue growing, it also meant that Arabs themselves became a smaller presence within their own dominions. Over time, the distinction between Arabs and non-Arabs became less clear, and eventually entirely new groups would dominate the political and military life of the empire. In the early 8th century, the empire reached its greatest extent with the conquest of Spain. The centre of the Islamic world now stretched across a vast zone from the lands of the rising sun in the east to the lands of sunset in the far west. The ruling dynasty stood at the height of its power, yet dangers were already gathering. Rival factions continued to challenge authority in Iraq, and unrest spread in the distant eastern province of Khorasan. Khorasan had long been difficult to control. Its remote location and natural barriers allowed ambitious governors to build independent power bases. Wealth from continuous campaigns accumulated in the region, and local leaders sometimes resisted attempts by the central government to claim a share of the spoils. One governor strengthened his position by establishing a large family that formed the core of a loyal following. Another relied on newly arrived settlers from Arabia and moulded them into a disciplined fighting force. These eastern armies pushed beyond the Oxus River into Central Asia and achieved remarkable successes. Yet ambition sometimes led commanders to challenge the authority of the caliph himself. One general threatened open rebellion but was abandoned by his troops and killed. Others followed similar paths, seeking independence and control of distant provinces. Revolt finally took shape in Khorasan under a movement that united many different groups. Persian peasants and nobles joined with Arab settlers and political dissidents who resented distant rule from the Western capitals. The rebellion was organized by a leader of uncertain background who spoke both Arabic and Persian with equal skill. Under his leadership, revolutionary armies advanced westward. Within a few years, the old dynasty collapsed. The final ruler attempted to defend his position along the banks of a northern river, but was defeated by the advancing forces. Dark banners, carried by mounted soldiers, marked the approach of the revolution. Observers described the scene as filled with signs of disaster and approaching doom. After the defeat, the last ruler fled southward, but was eventually captured and killed. His severed head was sent to the victorious leader, as proof that the old order had ended. The fall of the dynasty had many causes. Luxury and extravagance had weakened discipline. Heavy taxation had created resentment among the population. Soldiers, whose pay fell into arrears, turned against their masters. Most of all, the rulers had lost awareness of the conditions within their own empire. Warnings had been given, but they came too late to prevent disaster. The new dynasty that replaced them would build a different kind of empire. The earlier period, often remembered as the most purely Arab phase of Islamic history, had lasted little more than a lifetime. During that time, the Arab tribes had been united into a single people and had established control over a vast territory. Yet the divisions that developed during those years would endure long afterward. Ruins of desert palaces and hunting lodges still stand as reminders of that age. Some lie near modern settlements whose poverty contrasts sharply with the wealth once displayed in those buildings. The contrast reflects both change and continuity. Rivalries between families, tribes, and regions had shaped the earlier period and would continue to influence later history. The conflicts that once divided northern and southern Arab groups survived long after the dynasty that encouraged them had disappeared. Similar tensions appeared again and again under different names. The old opposition between desert traditions and settled urban life remained a powerful force. Centuries later, travelers from distant lands visited the great cities of the Islamic world. One visitor from Basra journeyed all the way to China and eventually gained an audience with the emperor. When asked to rank the rulers of the world, the emperor is said to have placed the ruler of Iraq at the center, with other kings arranged around him. Whether or not the conversation truly occurred, the idea reflected the position of the Islamic Empire at the heart of the old world of trade and communication. From the Atlantic shores to the frontiers of China, routes of commerce passed through the lands controlled by the caliphs. Cities along the great rivers and caravan roads connected distant regions into a single network. The empire stood at the midpoint of the inhabited world, linking east and west across the vast lands of Afro-Eurasia. The intellectual flowering of the Abbasid age was driven by a quiet but revolutionary invention: paper. Earlier generations had written sparingly on costly materials such as parchment and papyrus. But paper made writing faster, easier, and far less expensive. This shift transformed the circulation of knowledge in a way comparable to the modern transition from printed pages to digital screens. Words multiplied everywhere. Not every text was important, yet together they created an intense atmosphere of reading, copying, and discussion that defined the culture of the time. A popular story claims that paper technology reached the Islamic world after Chinese craftsmen were captured during the battle near the Sir Daria in the 8th century. The reality was likely more gradual. Paper may already have been known in eastern provinces before it became common in the western regions. What is certain is that during the Abbasid period, paper spread rapidly and became essential to administration and scholarship. Government officials were encouraged to use paper partly because writing on it was difficult to erase, making records more secure than older materials that could be scraped clean and reused. By the early 9th century, paper was already being used for manuscripts in major cities, and workshops soon appeared across Iraq and beyond. From these centres, the craft moved westward and became a foundation of intellectual life. Paper also changed the appearance of Arabic writing. Smooth sheets allowed scribes to develop faster and more flowing scripts that suited the growing demand for documents. Over time, writing itself became an art form. Decorative lettering appeared on manuscripts, buildings, and objects, creating a visual tradition that tied together distant regions. Artistic expression often centered on elegant writing rather than sculpture or painting, and beautifully shaped letters came to symbolize both faith and culture. Religious texts, poetry, and official documents all participated in this visual world. Writers compared letters to elements of beauty and emotion, turning the alphabet into a language of imagery as well as meaning. Ink and script became symbols of refinement, and literary creation was sometimes described as a form of ornamented beauty. Despite the elegance of this culture, most scholars were too busy to indulge in artistic fantasies. The written sciences expanded at extraordinary speed. Teachers held public sessions where hundreds of students copied down their words at once, rows of inkpots laid out before them. Officials struggled with mountains of correspondence that arrived faster than they could answer. Administrative procedures sometimes became so complicated that even minor matters required written authorization. The growth of documentation reflected both the size of the empire and the increasing reliance on written communication. At the same time, large private libraries appeared in many cities. Scholars and poets spent long periods studying earlier works, preserving traditions that stretched back into pre-Islamic times. Collections of books became symbols of prestige as well as tools of learning, and some were so large that transporting them would have required long caravans of pack animals. Massive historical works attempted to gather the knowledge of entire civilizations into single narratives, presenting the world as a connected whole in which the Arab Empire stood at the center of a vast human landscape. Travel and scholarship were closely linked. Some writers journeyed widely across Asia and Africa in search of knowledge, combining personal experience with written sources. Their accounts described lands from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean and beyond. This spirit of exploration reflected an older tradition of movement that had begun in Arabia and continued after the rise of Islam. The expansion of the empire had opened routes across enormous distances, and curiosity drove many individuals to follow them. Cultural exchange moved along these paths together with goods and people. Arabic language and literature spread across territories stretching from the Atlantic to Central Asia. Poets and scholars could encounter visitors from opposite ends of the known world, sharing texts and recitations that circulated with surprising speed. Verses composed in one region might soon be known thousands of kilometers away, demonstrating how ideas traveled within this connected environment. Confidence in this expanding culture encouraged openness toward knowledge from other traditions. Some thinkers argued that truth should be accepted regardless of its origin, and that wisdom could be learned from distant societies. Such views were possible only in a civilization that felt secure in its identity. The influence of this cosmopolitan culture extended far beyond the empire itself. Foreign courts adopted elements of Abbasid architecture and clothing, and Arabic styles appeared in distant cities. Garments and decorative forms associated with the Islamic world became fashionable across wide regions. Yet while Arabic language and customs spread outward, traditional observers increasingly felt that authentic Arab ways of life were fading. The transformation had begun with the Abbasid Revolution. Earlier, Arab leaders had lived comparatively simple lives, but the new rulers adopted elaborate court traditions influenced by older imperial models. Ceremonial distance separated rulers from ordinary people, and royal audiences became more formal. Court astrologers, luxurious garments, and jeweled headgear reflected a style far removed from the austere traditions of the desert. Political practices also changed. Methods associated with earlier empires shaped the conduct of government, and decisions sometimes followed precedents drawn from Persian experience. Stories circulated that illustrated the growing distance between rulers and the old Bedouin world. In one tale, a caliph lost his way while hunting and spent the night with a desert tribesman who did not believe the stranger's claims about his identity. Only when the ruler's entourage arrived did the host realize whom he had entertained. The story captures a sense that the center of power had moved far from its origins. Language and family life also reflected this transformation. court Arabic gradually diverged from the speech of the countryside, and some rulers lacked familiarity with words that had once been essential to desert life. Marriage patterns changed as well. Many caliphs were born to mothers from diverse regions, reflecting the mixture of peoples within the empire. This diversity strengthened the imperial system, but distanced it from older social patterns. Urban society replaced tribal life as the dominant environment, and individuals from many backgrounds rose to positions of influence. Non-Arabs became administrators and advisors, sometimes exercising greater authority than Arab nobles. Prominent families of foreign origin played leading roles in government, and their careers symbolized the merging of cultures within the empire. Stories about friendships and rivalries at court often revolved around tensions between inherited Arab identity and the realities of a cosmopolitan state. Political stability was difficult to maintain in such a complex environment. Rivalries within the ruling family intensified competition for power. Without fixed rules of succession, disputes between brothers could escalate into war. One particularly destructive conflict broke out after a caliph divided authority among his sons. The arrangement collapsed after his death, leading to a prolonged struggle that devastated the capital. Streets became battlefields, and the unity of the empire was deeply shaken. The defeated ruler was eventually captured and killed, and the victors relied increasingly on soldiers, recruited from distant regions rather than on traditional supporters. This shift marked a turning point, as military power gradually passed into non-Arab hands. While political unity weakened, scholars turned their attention to preserving the past. After generations of rapid expansion, many felt the need to define what it meant to be Arab. Intellectuals began collecting ancient poetry, tribal traditions, and linguistic knowledge from nomadic communities whose speech was considered pure. Researchers travelled into desert regions to record words and stories that might otherwise be lost. Their work resembled a form of cultural preservation, seeking to reconstruct a heritage that seemed to be disappearing. Informants sometimes found these investigations puzzling, wondering why scholars cared so much about minor differences in pronunciation or grammar. Yet the collected material formed the basis of dictionaries, histories, and literary commentaries that shaped later understanding of Arab identity. This scholarly effort emphasized the nomadic past, even though most people now lived in towns and farming communities. The desert became an idealized symbol of authenticity. Knowledge of ancient tribal battles and genealogies became essential for poets and officials alike. Writers in distant lands continued to celebrate Bedouin themes long after nomadic life had ceased to dominate society. The result was a lasting contrast between urban reality and desert imagination. Many people identified culturally with Arabic language and tradition, while simultaneously viewing tribal life as backward. This tension between settled civilization and nomadic heritage remained a persistent feature of Arab society. The preservation of language played a central role in shaping this identity. Scholars compiled dictionaries and grammatical rules that defined a standard form of Arabic based largely on Bedouin usage. Variations between dialects were reduced, and only selected forms were accepted as correct. Spoken Arabic continued to evolve in different regions, but written Arabic became more uniform. This standardized language strengthened the idea of a single Arab community, even among populations of diverse origin. At the same time, it created a gap between everyday speech and the formal language of literature and religion. The study of language influenced other fields of learning as well. Methods developed for analyzing grammar were applied to religious law and interpretation. Scholars increasingly focused on texts as the primary source of knowledge. Debates about philosophy and speculative thought gradually gave way, to greater emphasis on established interpretations. Eventually, religious authorities discouraged independent interpretation and insisted on adherence to recognized traditions. The ability to understand classical Arabic became essential for access to sacred texts, and specialists in language and interpretation gained great influence. Distinguished by their dress and learning, they formed a respected scholarly class whose authority rested on mastery of written tradition. The central place of language in intellectual life reflected the belief that divine truth was contained in sacred words. Religious education emphasized correct interpretation of scripture, and commentaries guided readers toward accepted meanings. Over time, these interpretations became deeply embedded in popular understanding. Even passages open to broader interpretation were often read through the lens of traditional explanations. The authority of earlier scholars shaped religious thought for generations, and written tradition came to define the boundaries of acceptable belief. By the Middle Abbasid period, written texts and their interpreters held a powerful position in society. The Arabic language had played a decisive role in building the empire, and it continued to shape intellectual life long after political power shifted. The sacred text of the faith was regarded as eternal and unchanging, preserved in its original form since the beginning of time. Some thinkers express this idea in highly symbolic ways, describing divine reality itself in terms of letters and words. Although such views were unusual, they reflected a broader conviction that language formed the bridge between humanity and the divine. In this environment, the authority of the written word grew ever stronger, guiding thought and belief across the centuries. The first great surge of Arab conquest and settlement had slowed by the 9th and 10th centuries. In many places, it had dissolved into local societies, leaving behind something more durable than armies or rulers: language. Arabic had spread across cities, markets, courts, and schools, becoming the medium of law, administration, theology, and prestige. For Abbasid authorities, that linguistic inheritance was both a triumph and a risk. A shared language could hold a vast realm together, but it could also become a battleground over who had the right to define meaning. As the state matured, it did not only try to coordinate provinces and collect taxes, it also tried to standardize the mental universe of its subjects. Words were not treated as neutral tools. They carried theology, politics, and authority. Whoever controlled interpretation could claim to guard social order itself. Over time, the idea of unity shifted. It was no longer only about shared allegiance or shared ritual or shared leadership. It became increasingly about shared definitions. The goal was not simply agreement in speech, but agreement in thought. This pressure to regulate meaning created friction, especially with figures whose spirituality did not fit neatly inside official boundaries. One of the most famous cases was a mystic whose life and death became a symbol of that struggle: Al-Hallaj. He was born in the mid-9th century in the region of Fars. Accounts of his background differ, and even his ancestry remains unclear in many retellings. He appears to have grown up with Arabic as a primary language, yet he also stood at the crossroads of cultures that defined the Abbasid world. Like many people of his era, he travelled widely. Movement was not unusual then. Trade routes were active, pilgrim roads were busy, scholars crossed long distances to study with teachers, and the empire's networks made travel possible on a scale earlier centuries could not easily sustain. Al-Hallaj is remembered as someone who pushed that mobility into the realm of ideas, observing religious life beyond the Islamic heartlands, and returning with a confidence that unsettled conservative minds. What made him infamous was not a military rebellion or an attempt to seize office. It was language, a short statement attributed to him became explosive. He declared, "I am the truth." In a religious culture where divine titles carried immense weight, such a phrase could be read as a claim that the divine had entered a human being. Traditional scholars and officials could interpret it as a dangerous collapse of boundaries between creator and creation. Even people sympathetic to spiritual experience could fear what would happen if such speech spread without restraint. But the deeper danger was not only theological, it was political and social. A statement like that implied that direct experience could challenge official mediation. If an individual could claim access to ultimate truth, then the monopoly of institutions over interpretation was weakened. The phrase did not simply shock piety, it threatened the structure that linked authority to controlled meaning. A century earlier, intellectual confidence had been broader in many circles. Curiosity about philosophy and distant sciences had been fashionable at court. Knowledge could be admired even when it came from outside inherited traditions. Over time, that openness narrowed. As the empire grew more diverse and as debates hardened into factions, many leaders and scholars became less willing to tolerate voices that could not be supervised. When identity feels fragile, boundaries tighten. When power feels threatened, independent speech becomes suspicious. A lone mystic speaking with certainty could be treated as an agent of chaos. Al-Hallaj also became associated with another idea that worried authorities for a different reason. He promoted the notion that someone unable to travel to Mecca could perform a symbolic alternative at home, then express devotion through acts of care for the vulnerable. The proposal sounded compassionate and practical. It also shifted emphasis away from public, collective ritual toward personal conscience and individual initiative. That shift cut close to the heart of communal religion. The pilgrimage is not simply a private spiritual act. It is a mass movement that visibly binds people into a single community. The journey itself, the shared hardship, the gathering in one place, the synchronized rites, all of it turns belief into a collective experience. Any teaching that seemed to replace that shared journey with a private substitute could look like an attack on unity. It suggested that the community's greatest ritual could be reimagined by individual choice. In a political order that relied on symbols of togetherness, that was not a small matter. So Al-Hallaj became dangerous in two ways at once. His words were interpreted as crossing theological lines, and his ideas appeared to weaken the rituals that dramatized communal solidarity. Authorities could frame him as a threat to both doctrine and cohesion. The result was brutal. He was executed in the early 10th century, and his death left a long shadow. His reputation did not settle after his execution. Centuries later, writers still disagreed about who he had been. Some saw a saint and a martyr, others a fraud, others a reckless provocateur. Stories about him multiplied, and the stories themselves reveal how contested his memory remained. Some accounts describe visions and marvels attributed to him in prison. Episodes that read like spiritual allegory rather than plain reportage. Whether these tales were meant to be believed literally or symbolically, they served the same purpose. They turned him into a figure larger than the court that killed him. The authorities could silence his body, but his image kept changing shape in the imagination of later generations. This is the paradox of repression. Executions can erase a voice in the present, yet they can also amplify it in the future. Al-Hallaj became a test case for how societies deal with claims of personal truth. When a culture is built around sacred language, disputes over interpretation are never only academic. They become disputes over power, legitimacy, and the limits of the self. And Al-Hallaj was only one sign of a wider unease. The Abbasid world of the early 10th century was not simply facing challenges from eccentric mystics. It was also facing strain within its own core. A story sometimes told about a traveller who reached faraway courts can sound like pure adventure, as if curiosity alone launched him across seas and deserts. Yet in several cases, such travellers were not only explorers. Some were fleeing pressures at home, escaping political danger, economic hardship, or the instability of urban life. That detail matters, because it points to a larger reality. An empire can appear magnificent from a distance and still be unstable at its centre. International prestige does not guarantee internal health. Titles and ceremonies can project strength even as trust frays. Factions multiply, and the machinery of governance becomes brittle. By the time Al-Hallaj's name entered the records as a warning and a scandal, the signs of strain were already visible. The realm's problems were not confined to distant frontiers. They were present in the capital's politics, in struggles over authority, and in the anxiety that drove leaders to police words as if words alone could hold a world together. In the late 930s, Baghdad could still look like the centre of a confident world. The river carried boats heavy with music and laughter. Wealth spilled into festivals, gardens, and night gatherings. Yet behind the noise, the city's politics had changed shape. The caliph remained the symbolic heart of the realm, but force no longer answered to him. One autumn day, a senior court tutor travelled along the Tigris to visit Caliph al-Radi. The city was celebrating Mihrajan, an old Persian seasonal festival that had become fashionable in Baghdad. On the way, the tutor passed the residence of Baj Khan, a Turk who had risen through the military ranks. What he saw there was not restrained court ceremony, but a public display of confidence, revelry, extravagance, and the unmistakable mood of a man who felt untouchable. The caliph's palace offered a different scene. Al-Radi sat alone, withdrawn and grim. When the tutor approached, the caliph showed him 2 coins, a gold dinar and a silver dirham, both unusually heavy. They carried Bajkam's image and a proud boast of power. In earlier centuries, Islamic coinage had been a careful language of legitimacy. Names and titles appeared in script, and the message was meant to be sober and restrained. Now, a commander who was officially a protector had pushed his own face into the most public symbol of sovereignty. It was not just a personal insult. It was a political announcement. Authority had changed hands, and everyone was expected to notice. The caliph understood what the coins implied. A guard had become a master, and the master was no longer hiding his ambition. Baghdad's elite could enjoy Persian festivals and Persian tastes without panic, because that blend had become normal. Turks felt different. They were viewed as outsiders from beyond the familiar borderlands, men whose power came from the barracks and whose loyalty could turn into ownership. Old warnings about steppe warriors circulated in popular memory, like proverbs that suddenly seemed less like folklore and more like prophecy. The empire had brought these soldiers to its core, paid them, armed them, placed them near the throne, and now the throne was trapped inside its own security system. For a moment, the tutor tried to lift the caliph's spirits with stories from the past, examples of rulers who had faced overmighty followers and recovered their position. It did not help. The only relief came when the tutor reminded him that it was a festival. Al-Radi did what a ruler can do when real control is gone. He performed normality. Bottles were opened. Companions were called. The palace filled. The caliph's celebration began to compete with the commander's celebration along the river. But the meaning of the day remained the same. This was not the triumph of a dynasty. It was the farewell party of a dynasty that could no longer command. By the mid-9th century, the Abbasid state had become vast enough to resemble a whole system of orbiting powers. not a single chain of command. The Caliph had once been the sun at the centre. Over time, that radiance dimmed. Provinces grew more autonomous, local warlords consolidated control, and the capital itself became dependent on those hired to defend it. The weakening of Arab political primacy did not happen only through palace intrigue. It was also shaken by upheavals that hit the empire's heartlands with terrifying force. One of the most shocking was the Great Slave Revolt in southern Iraq, remembered as the Zanj Rebellion. The region's economy depended on land, water management, and hard labour. Wealthy interests pushed for profit by importing large numbers of enslaved workers from East Africa and using them in brutal conditions, especially in marshland reclamation. Exploitation accumulated, and then it exploded. The revolt drew in more than a single group. It became a rallying point for the angry, the excluded, and those who believed the social order itself could be overturned. Whatever the precise numbers, the destruction was immense. Cities were sacked, supply routes disrupted, and entire districts terrorized. The psychological shock mattered as much as the physical damage. Slaves became masters, and free-born families faced humiliation that earlier generations would have considered impossible. The language of hierarchy remained, but its direction flipped. Words for patron and dependent could suddenly point the other way. The revolt was eventually crushed, but the message lingered. The empire's core was not immune, and the old assumptions of who must rule whom were no longer safe. The turbulence in southern Iraq did not end with the slave uprising. Not long after, rural communities and marginalized peasants became the engine of another radical movement. Leaders emerged who claimed moral authority against the elite, gathering followers among those who felt overtaxed and ignored. In eastern Arabia, one such movement built a state that aimed to be more egalitarian than the norms of the age. It organized public services and boasted institutions that impressed visitors. Yet even this experiment carried its own contradictions, including reliance on forced labor. Ideals could be proclaimed loudly while exploitation continued quietly. These militants did not limit their ambitions to local reform. They struck at symbols that held the Islamic world together. The most dramatic act was a raid on Mecca in the early 10th century, during which the Black Stone was taken from the sanctuary and held for years. Whether one reads it as robbery, political theatre, or deliberate sacrilege, its impact was the same. It suggested that even the spiritual centre could be assaulted, and that the unity embodied by pilgrimage could be challenged by force. At the same time, these movements proved something else. Arabic culture had become global in reach, and that global reach meant that intellectual life could no longer be confined to a single ethnic story. A group of learned writers compiled a wide-ranging set of treatises that attempted to gather the knowledge of the world into Arabic expression. Philosophy, mathematics, cosmology, ethics, and religious thought drawing from many older traditions. The language was Arabic, but the inputs were international. That was the empire's paradox in miniature. Arabic became the vessel, and the vessel could carry almost anything. While revolts and radical ideologies shook the ground, another struggle played out in ink, rather than blood. Educated non-Arab Muslims increasingly questioned Arab claims to inherited superiority. The faith's own moral language emphasized piety over lineage, yet social reality often contradicted that principle. Out of this tension grew a literary backlash that demanded equality and mocked Arab self-mythology. The critique was sharp. Arab ancestors were portrayed not as noble wilderness heroes, but as rough herders, whose harsh environment shaped harsh speech and harsh manners. The point was to puncture the romantic aura of desert virtue. Arab identity did not collapse under these attacks, but it hardened. Defenders of Arabness answered with their own rhetoric, insisting that Arabic eloquence and instinctive speech were unique gifts that outsiders could imitate but never truly own. Ironically, many of the loudest champions of Arab cultural prestige were themselves of mixed origin, shaped by the very empire that blurred the lines of ancestry. The argument was less about genetics than about ownership of a symbolic capital. Language, scripture, and the prestige attached to them. Even as these debates raged, the practical mechanics of power kept moving in one direction. The caliphs relied more and more on military slaves, and among these, Turkic soldiers became dominant. The logic seemed sound. Enslaved troops, cut off from local family networks, would be loyal to the ruler who purchased and promoted them. In practice, an armed class concentrated near the palace became the real kingmaker. Under one caliph, the chaos caused by these troops in Baghdad became so severe that an extraordinary solution was chosen. The court moved to a new capital upriver, a purpose-built military city designed to contain the army and separate it from the population. The result was a vast camp metropolis laid out to mirror the empire's diversity, filled with barracks, palaces, and parade grounds. It was a monument to controlled force. It was also an admission of weakness. When a ruler has to build a new capital to protect his own city from his own soldiers, the balance of power is already broken. The breakdown soon became visible in a grim pattern. Caliphs rose and fell at the whim of commanders, and the palace turned into a stage for coups, poisonings, and assassinations. A ruler might be installed in the morning and dead by night. Princes survived by being cautious, silent, and lucky. Even a caliph who tried to impose moral discipline found that piety was no shield. Attempts to ban pleasures or restrain the court could provoke the very men who held the swords. The result was often predictable and brutal. The throne remained gilded, but it had become a cage. By the mid-10th century, Turkish dominance in Baghdad faced competition from another force: Iranian mountain warlords who seized the city and ruled in the caliph's name. Their religious label differed from the majority, but sectarian identity was not the key. They understood that the caliphate's symbolic prestige could be preserved while its authority was emptied. The caliph could confer honor, approve titles, perform ceremonies. The warlords would command armies, collect revenues, and issue orders. That arrangement did not last forever, because a larger power was rising from the steppe: the Seljuks. They moved gradually into the Islamic world, adopting its religion, then using military service as a path into political control. When they finally entered Baghdad, they framed themselves as saviors of orthodoxy. Yet the deeper reality was the same. The caliph remained, but the sultan's power defined the age. Seljuk rule stretched across enormous distances. Their victories redrew the map of the Middle East and Anatolia. They could even cross social lines that earlier centuries had treated as taboo, binding themselves by marriage into the caliphal family and signalling, in the clearest way possible, who now stood above whom. Arab political primacy, once backed by unity and momentum, now survived mainly as title and ritual. Yet the story did not end with the disappearance of Arabic culture. Something unexpected happened under these new masters. The institutions that preserved Arabic learning and Islamic scholarship expanded dramatically. A powerful vizier, himself Persian, invested heavily in higher education, founding colleges supported by permanent endowments. These schools standardized curricula, trained jurists and scholars, and strengthened the intellectual infrastructure of Sunni Islam. They taught scripture, law, and the classical Arabic heritage, including pre-Islamic poetry that had become central to linguistic mastery. For rulers, Sponsoring such institutions offered legitimacy and moral prestige. For society, they created a professional class of scholars, whose authority would shape public life. Grand colleges were built across the Islamic world to preserve knowledge and religious learning. Their founders believed that supporting scholarship would secure both reputation in life and salvation after death. These institutions became some of the most lasting monuments of Islamic civilization. Many great cities of the medieval Middle East have left only faint traces of their former glory, yet the schools of learning often survived the centuries. In Baghdad, once the greatest city of the Old World, almost nothing from the Abbasid Golden Age remains visible today. One important exception is the Mustansiriya College, founded in the 13th century by an Abbasid ruler who followed the model established by earlier educational foundations. Though heavily restored and altered over time, the institution still exists, and its modern successor continues to function as a university. Its endurance reflects the remarkable continuity of the educational traditions created in the medieval period. The intellectual program developed in those early colleges proved equally durable. Classical Islamic law is still taught according to principles established many centuries ago. The study of Arabic grammar also follows patterns that would be familiar to a student from the late Abbasid era. Even in the modern age, students encounter grammatical systems that descend directly from medieval scholarship. It is striking that this vast tradition of learning was shaped largely by scholars and patrons who were not Arabs by origin. A Persian administrator and Turkic rulers played decisive roles in establishing institutions that ultimately preserved Arabic intellectual culture. These colleges helped maintain a sense of cultural unity across regions that were otherwise fragmenting politically. The Abbasid Empire had broken into separate states, but scholars trained in similar institutions shared a common language and intellectual heritage. Arabic remained the medium through which religious and legal knowledge circulated, even when political authority belonged to rulers of many different backgrounds. At the same time, the educational system encouraged a powerful attachment to the early Arabian past. Students studied pre-Islamic poetry and linguistic traditions as models of eloquence. Through this curriculum, the image of the ancient desert Arab became an enduring cultural ideal long after political leadership had passed into other hands. The institutions that preserved unity also reinforced differences. Most colleges supported Sunni teaching and rejected Shiite doctrines, deepening divisions that would shape the religious history of the region. Long before these developments, Arab expansion had drawn the peoples of the Middle East into a single arena stretching from the Atlantic to Central Asia. Later observers describe this history as a shifting balance of power between southern Arab regions and northern Turkic regions. At times, Arabs dominated the political landscape, pushing rival groups outward. At other times, Turkic or Iranian rulers held the initiative, and Arabs found themselves confined to more limited areas. The process resembled a slow movement back and forth rather than a simple rise and fall. Even during periods of decline, Arab families sometimes retained regional influence. One example was a dynasty based in northern Iraq and Syria that traced its origins to an old Arabian tribe. Their ancestors had migrated northward long before the rise of Islam and later adapted to the new political world created by the Abbasid caliphs. Their rulers combined military ambition with cultural patronage, leading raids against neighbouring territories, while also supporting poets and scholars. The court of one such ruler became a gathering place for intellectuals from many lands. Philosophers, musicians and poets found protection and rewards there. Some of the most celebrated figures in Arabic literature worked under his patronage. The environment blended inherited tribal traditions with the refined culture of the Abbasid cities. Warriors who prided themselves on their ancestral heritage could also appreciate philosophy and art. Political fragmentation weakened central authority but encouraged cultural activity. Rival courts competed to attract writers and scholars. Poetry flourished in this atmosphere, and ambitious authors travelled widely in search of patronage. Their careers often involved dramatic changes of fortune, moving from praise to satire as relationships with patrons shifted. Through their writings, many otherwise obscure rulers became part of Arabic cultural memory. While Arab identity survived strongly in some Western regions, the Eastern territories developed in a different direction. Arab settlement in Persia and Central Asia had always been limited, and local populations retained their languages and traditions. Arabic remained essential for religion and scholarship, but everyday speech increasingly followed Iranian patterns. Over time, independent states emerged that acknowledged the caliph only in name. In some eastern areas, early Arab administrators had struggled to establish religious practices among populations unfamiliar with Arabic. Attempts were made to encourage attendance at communal prayers and to accommodate local languages. Eventually, Arabic became dominant in religious contexts, but Persian speech remained widespread. The eastern provinces gradually developed their own political and cultural trajectories. Local rulers in these regions often maintained only symbolic ties with the caliphate. They governed independently, collected revenues for themselves, and conducted their own campaigns. Baghdad, once secure at the center of empire, became vulnerable to attack from ambitious commanders operating on its frontiers. The weakening of central power made it possible for provincial leaders to challenge the authority of the caliphs directly. Persian political influence increased steadily. Regional dynasties governed major territories, and Persian became an important language of administration and literature. Even Turkic rulers, who later dominated the region, adopted Persian culture as a marker of refinement. Arabic continued to serve religious scholarship, but the cultural foundation of the eastern lands grew increasingly Iranian. From the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, a cultural boundary gradually took shape. Scholars remained fluent in Arabic, and many Persian works incorporated large numbers of Arabic words. Yet the basic structure of intellectual life in these regions rested on Iranian traditions. Over the centuries, this Persianate culture would extend into Central Asia and India, shaping societies far beyond the original boundaries of the Abbasid Empire. In the Western Islamic lands, Arabic identity followed a different path. Political unity disappeared, but Arabic language and culture remained strong. Egypt provides one of the clearest examples of this process. There, foreign dynasties repeatedly seized power, yet Arabic culture absorbed them. Turkic commanders, African administrators, Kurdish rulers, and Ottoman governors all became part of an Arabic historical tradition. One striking figure rose from slavery to become the effective ruler of Egypt in the 10th century. Originally purchased for a small sum, he advanced through military service until he controlled the government. He understood the value of public reputation and rewarded poets who praised his rule. Writers from distant regions travelled to his court in hopes of gaining wealth and recognition. Some celebrated his achievements, while others later mocked him in biting verse. Political fragmentation created opportunities for cultural exchange. Scholars and poets moved freely from one court to another, carrying ideas and literary styles across great distances. Islam provided a shared religious framework, but the Arabic language played an equally important role in maintaining connections among diverse peoples. Through literature and scholarship, Arabic culture preserved a sense of continuity, even when political authority was divided. Egypt became a center where many influences merged. Over the centuries, successive ruling groups were absorbed into an Arabic cultural environment. The population developed a complex identity shaped by many historical layers. Despite this diversity, Arabic language and traditions came to dominate public life. A new ruling dynasty eventually took control of Egypt after the death of the powerful regent who had governed the country. Their general founded a new capital that would grow into one of the great cities of the Islamic world. Like many earlier commanders, he was a foreigner who rose through military service. The city he established later became a major center of Arabic learning and culture. The origins of this ruling house were widely debated. They claimed descent from the family of the Prophet, a lineage that would have made them both religious and political leaders. Many contemporaries doubted these claims and circulated alternative stories about their ancestry. Such disputes over genealogy reflected the importance of noble descent in political competition. Once firmly established in Egypt, the new rulers relied on military strength and economic resources rather than ancestry alone. They presented themselves as legitimate caliphs and rivals to the weakened Abbasid rulers in Iraq. Their court displayed great wealth and ceremony, yet over time their leadership became less energetic. Government responsibilities increasingly passed into the hands of ministers and commanders of various backgrounds. Despite their limitations, these rulers made lasting contributions to Arabic civilization. They transformed their capital into a major intellectual center and established institutions that would influence religious education for centuries. Their policies also had unintended consequences. By relocating large nomadic tribes from Arabia into North Africa, they accelerated the spread of Arabic language and culture across the region. These migrations reshaped North Africa over several generations. Arabic gradually replaced earlier languages in many areas, especially in open plains and settled districts. Mountain regions preserved older traditions, but the overall direction of change favored Arabic speech and identity. The process resembled earlier waves of migration within Arabia itself, where gradual settlement had transformed linguistic landscapes. The arrival of nomadic groups disrupted established patterns of agriculture and trade. Raiding and tribal conflicts became common features of life in some regions. Travelers often faced serious dangers when moving across North Africa, whether by land or sea. Despite these difficulties, Arabic language continued to expand westward, eventually reaching the Atlantic. In the far west, Arabic culture flourished in the Iberian Peninsula. There, a dynasty descended from early Islamic rulers established a powerful state centered on Cordoba. Their legitimacy rested on a clear lineage, and they took pride in their ancestral connections. Competition with rival rulers encouraged them to claim the title of caliph and assert their independence. The society that developed in Spain displayed an intense attachment to Arabic culture. Migration from Arabia and North Africa brought settlers from many tribes. Their descendants preserved traditions and genealogies that connected them to the Arabian past. Arabic became the language of administration, literature, and intellectual life. Scholars and artists from across the Islamic world traveled to Spain. Musicians introduced new styles of performance, while linguists taught refined forms of Arabic expression. Libraries grew to enormous size, and books were collected from distant regions. Copyists and scholars worked constantly to produce new manuscripts. Even after the central government of Cordoba collapsed, intellectual activity remained strong. Smaller states continued to compete for prestige by supporting poets and philosophers. Independent thinkers explored questions of faith and reason, sometimes proposing ideas that would later influence European scholarship. Throughout this period, nostalgia for Arabia remained a powerful theme. Writers described the homeland of their ancestors with deep emotion even when few could visit it. Pilgrimages and travel accounts kept memories alive. Living at the edge of the Islamic world encouraged a strong sense of identity rooted in language and tradition. Arabic culture transformed the Iberian Peninsula so deeply that even non-Muslims adopted the language. Christian communities wrote and read Arabic texts, and translations of religious works became necessary for those who no longer understood Latin. Arabic words entered everyday speech and remain part of Spanish vocabulary today. By the later Middle Ages, Arab identity had changed profoundly. The term Arab increasingly referred to nomadic groups rather than to the wider population that spoke Arabic. Most inhabitants of the Arabic-speaking world identified themselves in other ways, even while sharing a common language and cultural heritage. Political power had passed largely into the hands of non-Arab rulers, but Arabic culture endured. The Arab political nation had become a cultural nation, held together by language, education, and tradition. Cultural continuity replaced political unity as the main source of identity. This transformation marked the beginning of a long period in which Arabic civilization persisted, without a single center of power. Expansion slowed, and the dynamic energy of earlier centuries faded. Arabs became one people among many rather than the dominant force of a vast empire. Yet the cultural system they had created continued to grow. Arabic writing spread across continents, appearing on buildings, textiles, metalwork, and manuscripts. The script connected distant regions to a shared heritage. Teachers traced their intellectual lineage back through generations of scholars to the earliest transmitters of religious knowledge. Even rulers far from Arabia embraced Arabic culture. One prince near the Caspian Sea became famous for his mastery of calligraphy and poetry. Though his background was entirely Iranian, he achieved recognition for his elegant Arabic writing. He built a tall tower as his tomb, decorated with inscriptions that proclaimed his achievements and fixed his memory in stone. Cairo became the great stage of Arabic storytelling, long before the invention of cinema. For centuries, it functioned as the cultural center where history and imagination were performed for large audiences. Later generations would recognize Egyptian productions as the defining voice of Arabic historical drama. But the tradition itself stretched back to the medieval city. During the era of the Mamluk sultans, public storytelling and stage performances shaped the narratives that would later become famous across the Islamic world. Tales that eventually formed the cycles known today from medieval Arabic literature were refined in crowded markets and public squares where professional storytellers held listeners spellbound deep into the night. These performances gave historical figures and legendary heroes vivid personalities, blending entertainment with moral instruction and satire. Among the most popular forms of entertainment was shadow theatre, a lively street performance in which flat puppets were manipulated behind a bright cloth screen. The audience watched only the moving silhouettes, but the voices and dialogue brought entire worlds to life. The stories were often written in elevated Arabic, but filled with humour drawn from everyday life. Sharp jokes, playful insults, and occasional scandalous moments kept crowds engaged. The tone could be irreverent, and even powerful rulers were sometimes mocked. This theatrical tradition provides an appropriate lens through which to view the political reality of the later caliphs, whose authority had become more symbolic than real. Earlier centuries had known caliphs, who still carried traces of genuine authority, rulers regarded as earthly representatives of divine order. By the 14th century, however, the Abbasid caliphs surviving in Cairo held little more than ceremonial rank. One such figure Sulayman al-Mustakfi, descended from the once powerful Abbasid line, lived as a dependent of the Mamluk rulers. After the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in the 13th century, members of the Abbasid family had fled to Egypt, where they were preserved as living symbols of continuity. Their titles suggested dignity, but real power rested in the hands of the Mamluk sultans, who controlled the army and administration. Sulayman's personal fortunes reflected the reduced condition of his dynasty. Although he possessed an illustrious lineage, he found himself exiled far up the Nile after falling out with the Sultan. Removed from the capital and deprived of adequate income, he lived in relative poverty. His complaints survive in verses that mix irony and bitterness, describing a world where ceremonial honor masked material hardship. While officials continued to pronounce blessings on the caliph, his actual circumstances were marked by dependence and uncertainty. Even members of his household were forced at times to sell their possessions to survive. This decline in political influence contrasted sharply with the expanding reach of Islam itself. By this period, the religion had spread far beyond its original homeland, stretching across Africa and deep into Asia. Pilgrimage routes connected distant regions to Mecca, and Arabic remained the language of sacred learning. Yet Islam had outgrown its origins as the faith of a single people. The religion that had once been closely tied to Arab leadership had become a global tradition shaped by many cultures. Cairo emerged as one of the main centers of this new world, drawing scholars, merchants, and travelers from every direction. The Abbasid Caliph in Cairo retained symbolic importance for some believers as the representative of a long and respected lineage. His family traced its ancestry back to the relatives of the Prophet, a connection that still commanded respect even when political power had vanished. Yet the reality was unmistakable. A man who theoretically stood at the head of the Muslim world could be sent away from the capital with little ceremony and almost no resources. His situation illustrated how completely authority had shifted away from the Arab dynasties that had once ruled vast territories. During the centuries leading to this transformation, the remnants of the old Arab Empire had faced mounting pressures from many directions. Christian forces advanced from Europe in both East and West. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Crusades brought armies that established temporary states along the coast. In Iberia, the Reconquista steadily pushed Muslim rule southward. Spain became a region of constant struggle, with Christian kingdoms pressing from the north, while Muslim societies attempted to defend their shrinking territories. In some areas, Muslim communities faced threats, not only from Christian opponents, but also from rival Muslim groups arriving from North Africa. Egypt and Syria experienced similar upheavals. Crusader invasions disrupted trade routes and forced local rulers to organize defenses. Although the Crusaders were eventually pushed back, the conflicts reshaped political structures throughout the region. New dynasties rose to prominence, including the Kurdish family of Saladin. These rulers governed populations that were already accustomed to leaders of diverse backgrounds, and ethnic origins mattered less than military strength and administrative skill. After the Kurdish dynasty weakened, the Mamluks established their own system of rule, creating a powerful military elite that dominated Egypt and Syria for centuries. The Mamluks themselves formed a unique ruling class. Originally recruited as slave soldiers from the Turkic regions of Central Asia and beyond, they developed into a self-replacing military aristocracy. From the mid-13th century onward, they controlled the central lands of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their authority remained strong even after larger empires rose around them. Only the arrival of modern armies and new political systems would eventually end their dominance. At the moment, when the Abbasid caliphs lived as ceremonial figures in Cairo, the Mamluks represented the true center of power. Meanwhile, new dangers emerged from the east. Mongol armies advanced across Asia with unprecedented speed and destructive force. Their capture of Baghdad marked a decisive turning point. The city that had once stood at the center of the Islamic world became a symbol of lost greatness. Survivors fled westward, carrying with them memories of the old order. The Abbasid princes who found refuge in Egypt represented the final link to a vanished political age. By the time Suleiman lived in exile along the Nile, Arab political leadership had almost entirely disappeared. The communities that once formed the heart of an empire now found themselves surrounded by expanding powers. Europeans advanced from the west, Central Asian peoples from the north and east, and African movements from the south. Regions where continents met became arenas of intense competition. Peoples on the move collided at crossroads that had long served as centers of trade and communication. The earlier expansion of Arab rule had depended on mobility. Armies and tribes had crossed deserts and seas to build a vast realm. In later centuries, that energy faded, while other societies developed new forms of expansion. Arabs increasingly appeared as observers of events, rather than their main drivers. Cultural achievements continued, but political initiative passed into other hands. This transformation created the impression that a creative force had been confined within narrow limits. The civilization that had once expanded rapidly now faced barriers on every side. Yet even as political influence declined, the cultural legacy remained powerful. Language, learning, and artistic traditions continued to spread beyond the boundaries of Arab rule. The story of this period is therefore not only one of decline, but also of transformation, as an earlier empire gave way to a wider and more diverse world. In Norman Sicily, one of the most revealing visitors from the Arabic-speaking world was Ibn Jubayr, a traveller already known for observing the wars of the eastern Mediterranean. His role mirrors that of earlier Syrian observers of the Crusader states, but with a reversal of perspective. Some writers had watched Latin Christendom from within their own homeland, negotiating friendship and hostility on familiar ground. Ibn Jubayr moved through a different landscape, a parallel world where Arabic language and Islamic communities survived under Christian rule, and where the rules of status and power had been rearranged without fully breaking the older habits of administration and culture. He arrived during the reign of William II, a Norman king raised inside a court that still functioned in more than one language. Arabic was not an exotic decoration in this palace, but a working instrument of government. Muslim officials filled offices across the administration, and Arabic literacy was normal among the highest ranks. Palermo, the royal centre, impressed Ibn Jubayr with its architecture and its cultivated spaces. The city appeared to him as a place of refined residences and carefully tended gardens, a capital that displayed wealth without hiding its layered identity. It felt, in his description, like a court still drawing strength from an older Mediterranean openness. William's patronage extended beyond buildings and ceremony into scholarship. Ibn Jubayr describes a ruler who actively sought out physicians and astrologers, passing through the island, ordering them to be held and then offering them generous salaries. The practice could be read as admiration for learning, but also as a form of soft captivity, a way of turning expertise into property. Ibn Jubayr's tone carries an edge, as if the generous trap was itself a danger for Muslims tempted into long service under a Christian sovereign. The warning is not shouted, but it sits beneath the praise, and it suggests that the traveller was watching an uncomfortable truth. Sicily could feel more prosperous and intellectually hospitable than many places that were still politically Muslim. That discomfort becomes sharper when his attention shifts back toward Iraq. He describes Baghdad with a kind of stunned melancholy. The city remained symbolically important as the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, yet its visible greatness had faded. In his view, the name still carried weight, but the substance was thinning. Baghdad, once a magnet of empire and scholarship, had already begun to look like a relic whose reputation survived better than its streets and institutions. The great centres of earlier centuries had not simply moved, they had multiplied, then drifted again, with gravity pulling toward places better connected to the changing routes of trade, travel, and power. The Mediterranean itself had become one of those zones where gravity hovered. Sicily sat in the middle of sea roads that drew in specialists who could navigate cultures as well as coasts. Scholars, mapmakers, poets, and diplomats flowed toward Palermo and its surrounding courts, attracted by patronage and by the opportunity to work in a court that still valued Arabic learning. This traffic suggests a wider shift. Europe was no longer only a distant frontier seen from the perspective of older imperial capitals. It was becoming a place where resources concentrated, where new patrons could compete with the familiar centres of the Arabic world. Ibn Jubayr noticed another kind of lag in Baghdad, not only material but psychological. Many of its inhabitants behaved as if their city remained the unquestioned centre of civilization, even while new hubs rose elsewhere. He found some people charming, others grasping, others proudly unaware of how far the world had moved. That attitude, in his account, reads like an old habit refusing to die. It is the confidence of a capital that still thinks in imperial terms, even as the networks that once fed it have begun to bypass it. Yet Ibn Jubayr also records a rare human detail that cuts through the city's gloom. He describes seeing the caliph of his day crossing the river, and the description is unusually vivid. The caliph appears young, well-groomed, and carefully dressed, trying to pass unnoticed in a style associated with the Turkic military elite that surrounded the court. The detail matters because it shows what anonymity required. To disappear into the crowd, the head of the old dynasty had to borrow the clothing of the very forces that had hollowed out his authority. The portrait glows briefly, then darkens by implication, because it belongs to a city whose decline is no longer theoretical. A youthful face cannot reverse the tide. While Ibn Jubayr was measuring Sicily against Baghdad, another figure was building a different kind of legacy inside the Islamic world. Yaqut, known by a name that marked him as a former slave, moved in the opposite direction from the Mediterranean scholars invited into Norman service. He had been taken as a child from Byzantine territory and raised in Iraq. A merchant bought him, recognized his intelligence, and gave him an education that transformed his prospects. Later, he gained freedom, and what followed was a life of travel shaped by books as much as by roads. Yaqut became a wandering scholar in the fullest sense. He carried in his memory proverbs celebrating movement and exile, the idea that displacement can bring knowledge and opportunity. He moved through ports and caravan towns, worked, wrote, and kept going. In the libraries of Central Asia, he found collections so rich that they consumed his attention entirely. He describes falling on books with the intensity of hunger, forgetting comfort and distance as if scholarship itself were a country. That kind of mobility, powered by literacy and networks of learning, had been one of the engines of Arabic cultural expansion, long after Arab political dominance had faded. Even his name tells part of the story. He wished to replace the slave-marked name he carried with another, but the original clung to him. In the end, the name he made through writing mattered far more than the one he wanted. His works on poets, prose writers, and places became tools for later generations, surviving because they were useful, not because they were tied to a throne. His great geographical dictionary gathered the world into an ordered form, a map made of words, assembled by a man whose life had been shaped by forced movement and then by chosen travel. But this world of libraries, journeys, and scholarship soon ran into a threat that did not respect learning. In the early 13th century, disasters piled up. A major Egyptian port fell to Crusader forces, and at the same time an even more terrifying force broke into the eastern Islamic lands: the Mongol armies. Contemporary observers struggled to describe what they were seeing. The Mongols were written about as an event so immense that it seemed to swallow memory itself, making earlier catastrophes look small. Chroniclers predicted that nothing comparable would ever be seen again. The language becomes apocalyptic, not because writers were dramatic by habit, but because the scale of the destruction forced a new vocabulary. Yakut was among those driven westward by the advance. In a letter written during his flight, he describes roads lined with terror, armies collapsing, and scenes of death so frequent that survival felt like a narrow accident. He speaks of escaping just in time, of passing through spaces where violence had become routine, and of imagining himself joining the countless dead if his allotted time had ended. His words carry the shock of someone who had lived inside the world of books, and suddenly found that the world could burn its libraries and scatter its scholars in a single season. The devastation was not limited to cities. Rural systems suffered too, especially in regions dependent on delicate irrigation. Once canals were neglected and farms abandoned, the damage became long-term. In some places, recovery never fully came. The Mongol advance marked more than a change of rulers. It struck at the infrastructure that sustained settled life, and it made the earlier momentum of Arabic cultural spread look as if it had been forced into retreat by something more powerful than persuasion or scholarship. After the first shock, the Mongol expansion paused for a time, then returned with a decisive blow in the middle of the century. Baghdad, already weakened internally, became the final target. Long before the Mongols arrived, the social fabric of Iraq had been fraying. Travellers reported towns half ruined by raids, and Baghdad itself saw violent conflict among its own quarters. These were symptoms of a deeper disorder, but still only an overture to what came next. The death of the last Abbasid caliph in Baghdad remains uncertain in detail, but the end itself is clear. The dynasty that had ruled from that city for 5 centuries ended in violence. The institution had been living on borrowed authority for generations, relying first on military forces it could not control, then on foreign protectors who became masters. By the time it fell, it had long ceased to govern in the old sense. Yet its removal hit the Islamic world with enormous force because symbols can hold together what politics cannot. The caliphate had been a ceremonial front, but it was still a front that gave many people a sense of unity. The fall of Baghdad felt like history itself being erased. Libraries that had fed the scholarship of men like Yakut were destroyed or dispersed. A world that had stored its memory in manuscripts watched that memory sink into chaos. The shock was psychological as much as material. Even where Arabic culture remained vibrant, the idea of an unquestioned centre collapsed. The human figurehead and the geographic heartland were both removed, and many understood only then how much cohesion had depended on a symbol. This collapse also reshaped the relationship between settled society and tribal raiding. After the Mongol invasion, raids by tribal groups into cultivated lands became more persistent, feeding on weakened defences. Some thinkers interpreted the shift in grand historical terms, arguing that the loss of central authority and the erosion of moral and political order pushed societies back toward older patterns of insecurity. Whether or not the diagnosis was fair, the lived reality was clear. The balance that had once favoured cities and institutions was disturbed. At the same time, the crisis produced new saviors from unexpected directions. Earlier dynasties had relied on military slaves, and those military slaves had eventually seized power. In the 13th century, that cycle produced a ruling caste that proved unusually durable: the Mamluks. They were not a single tribe but a system. Young recruits were brought in from Turkic and Caucasian regions, trained in Arabic, instructed in Islamic practice, and drilled for war and administration. The education was strict and designed to produce elite soldiers who could also govern. The system created stability because it continually refreshed itself. New recruits replaced the old, preventing power from settling too comfortably into hereditary lines, though brief dynastic moments still occurred. The long-term result was a militarized state with a reliable supply of trained rulers. Under this regime, Egypt and Syria held together more securely than might have been expected in an age of invasions. Cairo expanded, crowded, and flourished, becoming one of the world's great cities. Its prosperity was rooted in trade and geography, but also in its dual identity. It was the capital of a ruling military elite, and at the same time a central metropolis of Arabic culture. In Cairo's streets and institutions, Arabic remained the dominant cultural force. The ruling soldiers could govern, but they entered a world whose language shaped legitimacy, law, scholarship, and prestige. The process of Arabization worked steadily. Foreign rulers and soldiers adopted Arabic to function, to be respected, and to communicate with the learned class. Over time, those who merged too fully into local society often lost their place in the elite, but the system solved that by importing new recruits. The ruling layer remained foreign in its origins, while the cultural atmosphere remained Arabic. True tribal Arabs did not vanish from politics entirely, but their role resembled their position in older imperial ages. They operated on the margins, negotiating, raiding, and switching alliances between larger powers. In the contested zones between Egypt and Iraq, tribal leaders played the Mamluks and the Mongols against one another, sometimes fighting for one side, then defecting to the other, then surviving independently through raids, when both turned hostile. Their mobility did not disappear, but it became a mobility of loyalty and opportunism, rather than empire building. The Mongols themselves did not remain unchanged. They moved through different religious identities across generations, and their western branches gradually adopted Islam, though their cultural language often leaned Persian rather than Arabic. This reinforced the separation between Arabic-speaking and Persian-speaking regions. Yet the Mongol period also created a strange opening. After conquest came relative peace across long stretches of Eurasia, allowing trade and travel to intensify across continents. Roads that had been too dangerous reopened, and the world briefly felt connected again on a vast scale. That renewed connectivity carried another danger. In the middle of the 14th century, plague swept across Eurasia and North Africa, killing an immense portion of the population. Writers described it like an invading army, moving from region to region with unstoppable momentum. Humour appeared in some accounts, a desperate attempt to speak while surrounded by death. But the result was still a sense of finality. Some chroniclers died mid-work, their histories breaking off as if the narrative itself had been cut. Later, another wave of destruction came with Timur, a conqueror who arrived as a delayed aftershock from the same Eastern world. His invasions devastated cities in the Levant and left behind deliberate displays of terror. Scholars could sometimes win his favour, but even that protection had a price, because learning became another tool of conquest. A historian spared by Timur might be required to produce intelligence about lands not yet invaded, turning scholarship into a weapon. All these pressures left Arabic-speaking societies, pinned within borders formed by stronger military powers and repeated shocks. Yet the western edge of the Arabic world still held a last bright enclave: Granada. In Iberia, earlier Muslim dynasties had fallen, Berber powers had risen, and Christian forces continued to advance. Granada survived as a small state, often paying tribute, clinging tightly to its Arab identity and presenting itself as an heir to a long tradition. Its society was mixed, shaped by refugees, conversions, and migrations. But its ruling court emphasized Arab lineage and Arabic culture with special intensity, as if concentrating what was being lost elsewhere. Granada's end came through a familiar pattern: internal conflict weakening a state at the worst possible moment. Its most famous monument, the Alhambra, fits this final phase with eerie precision. It is dazzling, but it is also an architecture of surfaces, where walls become screens for inscriptions and ornament. Arabic text wraps the palace like woven cloth. The building speaks through poetry carved into stone, celebrating itself in a voice that is proud and refined, yet also repetitive, leaning on long-established imagery. The effect is beautiful, but it can feel like a late style, a civilization producing brilliance inside narrowing space. Across these centuries, many observers sensed a decline in literary sharpness. Verse remained abundant, but inspiration seemed harder to find. Prose, too, became increasingly dominated by summaries, commentaries, and explanations piled upon older explanations. Knowledge turned inward, circling itself, sometimes preserving tradition, sometimes suffocating originality. Book losses from invasions and upheavals made the situation worse, shrinking the material base of scholarship and narrowing the range of surviving works. Still, new forms emerged even in difficult times. A genre of witty, highly stylized narrative, prose developed, built around clever tricksters and verbal performance. These stories spread rapidly and influenced later writing across languages. They also encouraged illustration in manuscripts, producing jewel-like images that survive as rare windows into the visual imagination of the period. One famous set of images shows mounted standard bearers, tightly composed, full of energy, as if an older imperial confidence had been captured on a page just before the world changed. The power of that image lies partly in its timing. It celebrates a court and a capital that were about to be destroyed. It suggests rallying points that no longer existed. Later generations returned to such images again and again, repeating them until they became symbols of a vanished peak. Meanwhile, the strongest traditions of miniature painting moved into Persian, Ottoman, and Mughal worlds, while painting in Arab lands did not retain the same momentum. The standard bearers remain vivid, yet frozen, like a march that never reaches its destination. Political power, literary production, and artistic energy seem trapped inside a repetitive present, bounded by foreign empires and recurring catastrophes. Yet an exit remained open where land routes narrowed. The southern seas offered a different kind of movement. Across the Indian Ocean and along monsoon coasts, merchants, scholars, mystics, and adventurers moved in a slower, less violent wave. Many left and never returned, dissolving into new societies far from the old heartlands. Their journeys produced fewer heroic legends, but they carried language, faith, and cultural habits across ports and islands. In some illustrated tales, a familiar rogue sails in a fragile boat past strange islands and uncanny creatures. That is fiction, but it echoes real mobility. Beyond the crowded theatres of war and invasion, sea routes continue to carry people outward. In that maritime world, Arabic culture could still expand, not by armies and capitals, but by travellers who crossed horizons and vanished into the wider ocean.